I'm Ganley, and this is my presentation on thermoregulation in dingoes.
Homeostasis is defined as an organism's way of maintaining a stable internal environment while external environments are being altered. When homeostasis is working properly, it stabilizes the functioning and health of the organism. Bodies have feedback control systems which are used to keep the stable internal environment. Homeostasis can occur through regulation of body temperature, osmotic balance, blood glucose levels, respiratory gas levels, and blood pressure. The regulation of an organism's body temperature is known as thermoregulation and occurs when the heat of the external environment is increased or decreased. Thermoregulation is defined as the ability of an organism to keep its internal environment within certain boundaries whilst its surrounding temperature is being changed. An organism can increase its body temperature when the external temperature is dropped. A disorder, called hypothermia, can occur when the optimum internal temperature of the organism's body cannot be kept because of extremely cold surroundings. So the internal temperature is therefore decreased drastically. The same organism will also have the ability to decrease its internal body temperature when external temperatures are increased. The opposite of hypothermia is called hyperthermia, and this is when the organism's normal internal temperature cannot be kept because of too much heat, resulting in its internal body temperature increasing to an extreme. There are two receptors in an organism which measure temperature for thermoregulation. One is called the core receptor because it is within an organism's body in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus measures the organism's blood temperature in the brain and sends signals back to the rest of the body to use processes which warm or cool them. The second types of receptors are called thermoreceptors, which are part of the sensory system. These are found in various tissues, including the skin. These receptors are responsible for sensing the external environment change and sending a message to the integration center. Organisms can be split into two groups of ectotherms and endotherms. Ectotherms are referred to as cold-blooded animals, for example, reptiles, and they use external sources of temperature to regulate their internal temperature. Endotherms, on the other hand, are referred to as warm-blooded, and this includes all mammals. Endotherms use metabolic processes to regulate their internal temperatures. An example of a metabolic process used for cooling would be evaporation of water through respiratory surfaces or from sweat glands in the skin. The hypothalamus is a gland in the brain which is the control for the maintenance of an organism's internal temperature. It gives a set point for the optimum internal body temperature, and in response to sensory signals from temperature receptors known as thermoreceptors in the skin, the hypothalamus constantly compares the set point to the blood temperature. If the temperatures of the set point and the blood do not match, the hypothalamus then activates temperature increasing or decreasing procedures until they match again. This is known as thermoregulation. The Canis lupus dingo, or commonly known as just the dingo, is Australia's largest terrestrial predator, and while mainly found in Australia, they also live in areas of Southeast Asia. In recent years, the dingoes have been found to be from the same species as dogs and wolves, which makes easy crossbreeding and means that the dingo has similar adaptations to that of a dog or a wolf. Dingoes use thermoregulation to maintain their internal temperature while the heat of Australia is increased and decreased through the seasons. They are warm-blooded endotherms, which means they use metabolic processes to keep their temperature balanced with the hypothalamus set point. In a feedback loop, the stimulus is the change in an external environment which causes communication in the senses to feel the change. The stimulus in the dingo for thermoregulation is the environment's temperature increase or decrease. The sensor is the part of the feedback loop which detects a change in the environment. For thermoregulation, the sensors are thermoreceptors, and in the dingo these are found in the skin and deep in the body tissues. The receptors then send information to the integration center, otherwise known as the hypothalamus, where the temperature of the dingo's blood is compared to the original set point. And then temperature amplifying or temperature decreasing procedures are used to return the temperature back to the set point. This is known as a negative feedback loop. With the high heats of the Australian desert, the dingo uses a negative feedback loop in order to cool itself through metabolic processes. The dingo uses thermoregulation to maintain its constant internal temperature when the heat of Australia is increased or decreased using metabolic processes. The dermis of the dingo supplies it with numerous nerve endings, so the skin is sensitive to temperature as well as touch and pain. The sensory neurons of the dog then carry information to the hypothalamus, where the new blood temperature which has been detected is constantly being compared with the set point value. Because of the heat of Australia, the dingo's normal feedback loop is a negative feedback, as it needs to reduce the dingo's internal temperature to return to the optimum temperature. The metabolic processes used to cool the dingo include panting and sweating. Sweat glands, which are located in the ears and paws of the dingoes, only play a minimal role in the thermoregulation of the dingo. The evaporation of liquid from the skin surface gives a cooling effect. However, because the dingo is covered in fur, sweating is a very minimal part of the animal's thermoregulation. The primary method for a dingo to cool is through panting. Panting provides an increase of airflow over its upper respiratory tract through rapid shallow breaths. The air which is inhaled cools the surface of the lungs, and the air exhaled loses the heat. The dingo has many adaptations to help it survive in the wild. There are a few adaptations I found which help it to survive in the hot Australian desert. Their thinner coats help them to stay cooler in hotter areas, and their minimal amounts of fat mean they are not being insulated when it is unnecessary. The small amounts of fat stored are also an advantage for the dingo while they are running, as they will not feel the heat as much as an animal which stores lots of fat trying to run in the same temperatures would. It has been found from studies of the behaviour of dingoes that it can go 3 weeks without a drink, as they get water from blood or fat reserves in their body. However, the dingoes will mostly drink around once a day. The last adaptive advantage of the dingo to survive in the heat of Australia and a procedure for thermoregulation is their use of panting. As explained before, when the dingo pants, it provides an increase of airflow over the respiratory tracts, which effectively cool it down. This is an advantage to the dingo, as it is an energetically efficient way of heat reduction, which means the dingo can use the energy for more productive purposes such as breeding and hunting for food. The inland deserts of Australia can remain completely dry for years. If we put the dingo into a scenario where it could not migrate from an inland desert into an area with sufficient amounts of water because a fence had been built to section off the desert, the dingo would eventually die. This is because, although it can last for weeks without the dingo would not be getting its water supplies, which are needed for successful negative feedback loop. For the disrupted feedback loop, the stimulus would still give the thermoreceptors, the sensors, the signal of heat. The thermoreceptors would use the normal communication pathway to send a message to the hypothalamus, the integration center, which would be compared to the set point of the dingo's body, just as usual. However, due to the lack of liquid stored in the dingo's body, when the hypothalamus tries to send negative feedback around the body to the effectors to cause sweat and panting, the effectors would not be able to do their job of cooling the animal. Eventually, the dingo would develop hypothermia through the overheating of its internal environment, and it would die due to the absence of thermoregulation. The Canis lupus dingo is a subspecies from the same species as dogs, wolves, and other animals of the likes, which is found in areas of Southeast Asia and Australia. The dingoes use the homeostasis control system called thermoregulation, where it uses a negative feedback loop in order to stabilize its internal environment while the external environment is being increased or decreased. The mechanisms which the dingo uses through thermoregulation are sweating through glands on their paws and in their ears, and through panting, which evaporates liquids from the respiratory tracts. The dingo also has other adaptive advantages such as little fat stored on their bodies and thinner fur, which are energy efficient and mean the energy can be spent on hunting, reproduction, or looking after young.